French victories at Marengo and Hohenlinden in 1800 forced Austria to sue for a separate peace, leaving the United Kingdom as the leading member of the Second Coalition. Napoleon's forces dominated on land, so the only way for the United Kingdom to continue the war was via naval actions. The British Navy was blockading France from receiving foreign goods, and in turn forced Prussia, Russia, Denmark and Sweden to ally against Britain to defend the trading routes. While the Russian Navy was in its winter harbours, the British attacked Copenhagen in 1801 and forced Denmark to leave the alliance. When the Russian Tsar Paul I died a month later, his heir, Alexander I, was more lenient towards the United Kingdom, and the anti-British Union ceased to exist. France had its share of problems. One of its colonies, Haiti, had revolted in 1791. Napoleon decided to send an expeditionary force to restore French rule over the island and its lucrative sugar industry in late 1801. The British fleet chased the expedition across the Atlantic Ocean. The island was blockaded and the French received no supplies or reinforcements. It was clear that neither side could strike the final blow, and a peace treaty was signed in March of 1802 at Amiens. The British promised to return the French colonies and leave Malta and Egypt, while Napoleon had to rescind control of Naples and the Papal States. For the first time in a decade, Europe was at peace. Napoleon sent a new expedition to Haiti, but it failed. Holding on to the colonies proved to be extremely difficult, so in April of 1803, the vast territory of Louisiana was sold to the United States. The Haitian expedition, and the fact that Napoleon was asserting control over Switzerland, was worrisome for the United Kingdom. On the other hand, the French demands for Britain to leave Malta and Egypt were left unheeded. Napoleon started preparing a new force at Boulogne to invade the British Isles, but it was the United Kingdom who declared the war that would be later known as the War of the Third Coalition in May of 1803. Napoleon was not expecting the renewal of hostilities, and his fleet was scattered across various harbours, with 21 ships of the line in Brest, 12 in Toulon, and 9 more in the Atlantic. The superior British Navy blockaded both ports. Napoleon developed a plan in the summer of 1804. One of his fleets needed to break the blockade, move into the open sea, then attack the part of the English Navy blockading another harbour and unite with the portion of the French fleet stationed there. That would have allowed the French to get the army at Boulogne across the English Channel. The situation changed for the better for the French in October when the British sunk some Spanish vessels. This provoked Spain to declare war on the United Kingdom and ally itself to France in December. Napoleon now had the numbers to implement his plan. In late March of 1805, the French commander at Toulon, Vice Admiral Pierre Villeneuve, ordered his fleet to sail out. He managed to evade the loose blockade set by British commander Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. It seems that the British commanders were sure that Napoleon would try to land a force in Italy, so the majority of Nelson's vessels were around Sardinia. However, Villeneuve was implementing Napoleon's plan. He passed the Straits of Gibraltar in early April, was joined by some Spanish ships, and continued towards the Caribbean. Nelson got this intelligence only in late April, and started his pursuit across the Atlantic. The French arrived at the Caribbean Sea basin in May and captured a few British outposts. Nelson reached the area in June, but was still one step behind Villeneuve. Despite that, the French weren't able to inflict much damage to the local British colonies and started moving back to Europe, arriving in the second half of July. A smaller British fleet under Vice Admiral Calder was ordered to stop Villeneuve, but the subsequent battle near Cape Finisterre was indecisive. Still, this encounter prevented the French from reaching Brest to lift the blockade, and they returned to Cadiz. At the same time, Austria and Russia joined the Third Coalition, and Napoleon had to march his army stationed in Boulogne to the east, which meant that the invasion of the British Isles was postponed. Nelson was appointed the overall commander of the Royal Navy, and as the allied French-Spanish Armada concentrated in Cadiz, he sent the majority of his fleet off the coast of France to block Villeneuve. By the end of September, he joined the fleet personally. Villeneuve received an order from Napoleon to move towards Italy, but ignored it. On the 18th of October, the French commander received a new order to stay in Cadiz and wait for his replacement. Once again, the order was neglected, and the Allied fleet went to sea on the 20th. On the 21st, Villeneuve's navy was getting close to the Straits of Gibraltar. Nelson allowed the French to move as far away from Cadiz as possible to prevent them from retreating. However, by dawn the British vessels were detected. Villeneuve didn't expect Nelson's navy to be so strong, so he ordered his ships back to the harbour. This manoeuvre failed due to lack of training, and the Allied fleet ended up with an incoherent line. The usual tactic of the age was to approach a foe and enter a shooting match, so the fate of the battle was decided by the quality of the ships, crew training, and sheer luck. Instead, Nelson divided his fleet into two halves to attack the Allies broadside. He was personally leading the northern group that had 13 ships of the line, with his flagship Victory in front, while Vice Admiral Collingwood's squadron of 14 ships of the line was to the south, led by the flagship Royal Sovereign. By midday, the distance between the two navies was just 5 kilometers. They were off the coast of Cape Trafalgar, and Nelson issued his famous order. England expects that every man will do his duty. Royal Sovereign was recently repaired and was faster than most ships, so the wind moved it dangerously close to the enemy line, while the other ships in the squadron were lagging behind. At 12:20, Royal Sovereign fired the first volley upon Santa Ana and Forgo, and these vessels shot back. Collingwood's flagship was attacked by 4 enemy ships. Only 15 minutes later, Belle-Île arrived and covered the right board of Royal Sovereign. More English vessels moved into the fray and tried to cut the Allied line, but Collingwood was outnumbered at the initial point of contact. Still, the positioning of the Allied navy didn't allow its second-line ships to assist, and by 1400 the majority of the first-line vessels were either sunk or surrendered. To the north, Nelson's squadron got close to the enemy line by 12:20, but the wind was calming, and that made Nelson's ships a very slow target. His refusal to fight using traditional line tactics was detrimental at this point of the battle, as none of his ships were able to shoot, while the enemy was sending volley after volley. Despite casualties, the flagship Victory was moving forward. Nelson ordered a fake maneuver to make the enemy think that his ships would form up in a line, but instead he then ordered one more turn, and Victory ended up between the French flagship Boquenteur and the smaller Redoutable. This allowed Nelson's ship to use the guns on both sides. The French ships needed to turn, and Victory used that to take Boquenteur out of the game. However, Victory itself was taking massive damage from Redoutable. The French ship was also using sharpshooters, and at 13:15 one of their shots wounded Nelson. It was clear that this wound was deadly. Redoutable's crew attempted to board Victory, but the British managed to stop them. Victory was soon reinforced by Temeraire, which moved across Redoutable's left board and started shooting, and by 14:20 Redoutable was captured by the crew of Temeraire. To the north, British Neptune entered into a battle with Spanish Santísima Trinidad and managed to take it out of the fight. By 1400 it was becoming clear for Villeneuve that he was losing the battle, and he ordered the northern portion of his line to move to the southwest and collapse on the British fleet. However, the captains of these ships failed to see the signal, and this became the final mistake of the Allied fleet. Villeneuve's Boquenteur was in no shape to continue fighting, and soon he surrendered. By the time the remaining 10 Allied ships started their move to assist, most of the vessels in the centre were either sunk or captured. Collingwood took overall command of the British Navy and ordered Nelson's squadron to intercept the French reinforcements. The remaining Allied ships decided to retreat. It was a complete victory, with the British capturing 18 enemy ships. Nelson passed away as soon as he heard the news of the victory. The French defeat at Trafalgar confirmed the naval dominance of the United Kingdom, and meant that Napoleon would not be able to invade Britain. But while the battle was raging at sea, the Emperor's Grand Army was moving into Germany against the Allied Austrian and Russian armies. French victories at Marengo and Hohenlinden in 1800 forced Austria to sue for a separate peace. The Treaty of Lunéville acknowledged the new French satellites in the Netherlands, Switzerland and Italy, alongside holdings in Tuscany and the left bank of the River Rhine. Meanwhile, Russian Tsar Paul I was getting closer to Napoleon and even considered a campaign against Britain in India. In 1801, Paul was assassinated by a group of conspirators funded by the British government. The new Tsar, Alexander I, was more lenient towards Britain, but he didn't re-enter the conflict, and in 1802 France and Britain signed a treaty in Amiens that ended the War of the Second Coalition. Despite that, the two countries still had ample reasons to fight, and a year later Britain declared war again. The initial phase of the conflict that would be known as the War of the Third Coalition took place at sea. Napoleon needed to gain naval dominance to transport 200,000 troops to the British Isles, so the British tried to get rid of the French fleet and that of the new French allies, the Spanish. Other European powers were not eager to join the conflict, but two events changed that. In March of 1804, one of the representatives of the toppled French dynasty of Bourbon, Duc d'Aignan, was seized by the dragoons of Napoleon in the neutral Baden and then executed for treason. The news shocked the royal courts of Europe. In the same year, Napoleon was coronated as the Emperor of the French, and in 1805 as the King of Italy, which meant that he considered himself an equal of the Austrian and Russian emperors. All this forced Sweden, Naples, Austria and Russia to ally with Britain and enter the war. The Allies outnumbered Napoleon almost 2-1. They planned to move 90,000 Russian troops to the Prussian border to force it to join the alliance, while a 50,000-strong Russian army under Kutuzov had to move into the Holy Roman Empire and help the 120,000 Austrian troops. 40,000 Russians and Swedes were to land in northern Germany to threaten the Low Countries and northern France. 100,000 Austrians were to enter Italy to push the French out, while Britain and Russia promised to help the armies of Naples in southern Italy. It was clear for the French Emperor that he needed to make a decisive strike against one of these forces and take it out of the game to have any chance of winning the war. The Allies expected him to move to Italy, as he did in the first two wars. He had around 300,000 men near Boulogne and sent 70,000 commanded by Massena to Italy to defend the southern borders of France. 30,000 were left in Boulogne, while the rest of the army, some 180,000, started moving towards the Rhine and reached it by the 25th of September, where they were reinforced by 10,000 troops from Bavaria and Württemberg. Meanwhile, Austrian General Mack and his 70,000 men were ordered to defend the road to the capital Vienna along the River Inn and wait for Kutuzov. But the Austrian commander decided to move his base to Ulm to defend the mountainous Black Forest region. Now he was 700 kilometers away from Kutuzov. Some historians claim that there was miscommunication between the Austrians and Russians, as the former used the Gregorian calendar and the latter the older Julian, which meant that there was a 12-day discrepancy. This prevented Kutuzov from reaching the area in time. Napoleon knew that Mack could be easily dislodged, but then he would either move to the east to unite with Kutuzov or to the south to enter Italy. Instead, the French troops crossed the Rhine on the 26th. Two corps were moving close to the Black Forest to delude Mack into thinking that he would be attacked from the front, while only one corps was threatening the Austrians from the north. French troops were moving extremely fast, and by the 6th of October, Mack was cut off from his supply lines to the east. Mack attempted to break the encirclement on the 8th, but his general lost at Vertingen, and the French used that time to move behind the Austrians. Two more attempts were made to break out, but the French won the resulting battles, and by the 14th, the Austrian army was blockaded at Ulm. A group of cavalry managed to break through the French line, but was then caught. Mack surrendered on the 20th upon receiving irrefutable proof that Kutuzov was still weeks away. More than 60,000 Austrians became prisoners of war, while the French had lost around 2,000 troops. The Ulm campaign is considered to be one of the most significant victories for Napoleon. If I can't be in London in 15 days, I will be in Vienna by the middle of November. On the 26th, French troops regrouped and started moving east. Kutuzov learned about Mack's defeat and decided to retreat with his 60,000 towards the secondary Russian army under Buxhowden. The Allied army moved slowly, fighting a number of rearguard battles, and wasn't able to defend the Austrian capital. On the 12th of November, Vienna was occupied by the French, and Napoleon entered the city on the 15th, as he predicted at the beginning of the campaign. Although Napoleon continued chasing Kutuzov, the latter finally united with Buxhowden on the 20th and now had 90,000 soldiers and 318 guns under his command. By that point, Napoleon's forces were scattered along the Danube River to contain the Austrians in Italy, and he had only 53,000 troops and 157 guns with him. His troops were tired due to the constant marching and fighting, and on the 23rd he ordered a halt at Brunn in the modern-day Czech Republic. Napoleon needed to win a decisive battle, and he ordered the nearby corps amounting to 20,000 men to join him. At the same time, he was projecting weakness to force the enemy to attack him. His troops abandoned the town of Austerlitz and the Pratzen Heights. Napoleon also tried to initiate negotiations with the Austrian Emperor Francis and Russian Tsar Alexander. The latter concluded that the French were in bad shape. Kutuzov, who was the overall commander of the Allied army, advised caution, but he was deposed, and hotheads gained the upper hand. The Battle of Austerlitz took place on the 2nd of December 1805. The French Emperor deliberately weakened his right flank to lure the enemy in, but then his nearby reinforcements were ordered to move to cover this position. The majority of the troops were concentrated in the centre and on the left flank. Napoleon knew that his right flank would be perfect bait, and that the enemy would stretch its forces to attack his right from both the front and sides. Indeed, the Allied forces attacked here at 7 AM, and French troops slowly retreated from the village of Telnitz. A second column joined the attack, and a third arrived as the French reached Sokolnitz Castle. The battle continued here until part of the corps of Marshal Davout arrived and helped the French retake Telnitz. Still, the Allies outnumbered the French 2-1 and drove them back out of the village. The remainder of Davout's forces joined the defence of Sokolnitz, which was crucial to the French plans. Despite mounting pressure, Napoleon's troops held their ground. The Allied right flank attacked the French left, hoping that pinning it down would allow them to crush the French right. By 8 AM, the sun finally dissipated the fog on the Pratzen Heights, and Napoleon saw that only Kutuzov and his fourth column were there. The strong French centre was hidden from the enemy's view, so Tsar Alexander ordered this column forward to attack the French right from the north. At 9 AM, Napoleon saw the Allied centre was weak and sent his centre ahead. The French attack stunned the Allies, and they lost control of the Pratzen Heights. However, reinforcements from the Allied right arrived and helped retake this position. This weakened the remainder of the Allied right wing, and this time Napoleon ordered his reserves to join the attack. The Pratzen Heights were taken once again, and a wedge was driven between the centre and the right of the Austro-Russian army. The majority of troops were now in play. The Allies attempted a counterattack in the north, but it was stopped, and the right flank of the Allied army was forced to retreat. Russian guards tried to drive the French from the heights, but the French left attacked them from the north, causing the guards to also leave the battlefield. The order to retreat to the east was sent to the Allied left, but it was either ignored or impossible to implement as the French attacked from the north. The Russians attempted to move across the Sashchan Pond, which was covered in ice. A French artillery bombardment broke the ice and thousands of Russians drowned. The battle was a resounding French victory. 36,000 Allied soldiers were either killed or captured, while Napoleon lost just 9,000. His troops were too tired to chase the enemy, and that meant the war would continue. Napoleon utterly defeated the Allied Austro-Russian army at the Battle of Austerlitz in early December 1805. A separate peace at Pressburg was signed by the end of the month, as Austria had no capacity to continue fighting. Austria had to recognize Bavaria and Württemberg as kingdoms, ceding a number of provinces to them in Germany, while Napoleon received the provinces of Venetia and Dalmatia as the King of Italy. France was also promised 40 million francs in war indemnities. The Russians were given a free pass to retreat through Austrian territory, as the French troops were too tired to chase them anyway. Prussia was planning to join the coalition in 1805, but was delaying declaring war on France. The Allied defeat at Austerlitz was alarming for the Prussian king Frederick William III, and in early 1806 he signed a treaty with Napoleon. The Prussians had to cede a few provinces to the German allies of France, while they would receive in return French-occupied Hanover, which belonged to Britain. Prussia also formally entered the alliance with France against Britain. Meanwhile, the Austrian forces, which were keeping French command in Italy Messene occupied, returned home, and that allowed the French to concentrate their forces against the Kingdom of Naples. In February 1806, Massena invaded Naples. Although the British expedition of Stuart supported the Neapolitans, they lost the decisive battle at Campo Tenese, and by the end of July, King Ferdinand IV and General Stuart had to retreat to Sicily. All of mainland Italy was now under French control, and this situation would remain unchanged until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Since Britain and Russia did not share borders with France and were not eager to start an amphibious invasion, the War of the Third Coalition was effectively over, and Napoleon started forming a new order in Germany. In July 1806, he established the Confederation of the Rhine, consisting of 16 German states, with himself as the protector. This gave Napoleon a buffer between France and the most influential German states, Austria and Prussia. On the 6th of August, he declared the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire, which had existed since 800. All this was insulting for Prussia, and as Napoleon offered to return Hanover to Britain to procure peace, war became inevitable. The Prussian court was divided, with the king leading the peace party, while his spouse, Queen Louise, was nudging the country into conflict. Finally, the war party won, and on the 10th of August, Prussia started mobilizing its army. In the next 2 months, Prussia was able to enter the alliance with Britain and Russia. Napoleon learned about the Prussian mobilization in early September and ordered 50,000 conscripts to join the army. The French troops were stationed all over Germany, and Napoleon was not ready to go on an offensive just yet. Prussia used that to enter Saxony and conscript 20,000 locals into its army. Napoleon demanded that the Prussian army leave Saxony, but on the 1st of October received an ultimatum to leave the lands to the east of the Rhine. On the 6th of October, the War of the Fourth Coalition began. Both France and Prussia had about 200,000 troops. However, there was no unity in the Prussian army, and it had 3 formal leaders. A number of generals advised a defensive approach, with a slow strategic retreat in the hopes that Bennigsen would soon join them with more than 100,000 Russians under his command. However, this plan was ignored, and a more ambitious plan created by the Prince of Brunswick, Charles William Ferdinand, was adopted. The Prussians were going to go on the offensive, take Stuttgart in Württemberg and cut Napoleon from a portion of his forces and France. Meanwhile, the French Emperor had already decided on his moves. He was going to move towards the Prussian capital of Berlin from the southwest, which meant that his troops would be able to avoid the majority of the rivers. Just a few days after the declaration of war, Napoleon was already on the move. It seems that neither army was sure about the location of the enemy, but Napoleon's plan was better, as it was cutting the Prussians from the Russians and Berlin, and therefore forcing them to fight. Due to scouting reports, Napoleon was now sure that the Prussians were concentrating near Jena. However, the latter finally understood that the French army was no longer in Württemberg and was moving fast to cut the roads to Berlin, and some of the Prussian forces started moving to the north. Indeed, just 3 days after the war began, Napoleon's troops ended up to the south and east of the Prussian army, and due to their faster movement, concentrated and defeated the Prussians in the first battles of the campaign at Schleiz and Saalfeld. Once again, the French were too quick for their opponents, and two corps, alongside the cavalry reserve, ended up to the northeast of the Prussian positions. The Prussians were not encircled, but as the road to Berlin was open to attack, they had to stand and fight. The twin battles of Jena and Ostend took place on the 14th of October. In a way, it was two distinct battles, as the two locations were more than 30 kilometers from each other, and the two battles never combined into one. The French had about 40,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 110 guns at Jena under the overall command of Napoleon, against 34,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 15 artillery batteries of the Prussian Prince Hohenlohe. The French centre was commanded by Lannes, the left flank by Augereau, and the right by Soult. Napoleon ordered his troops to take Landgrafenberg, the plateau that prevailed over the battlefield. Part of the plateau was taken by the French during the night, but they needed more space, so at 6 AM an attack commenced. The French centre took Clausewitz, while the left captured Cospeda. The Prussians lost the hill. Hohenlohe now understood that he was fighting the main French army, and asked for help from the reserves at Weimar. The Prussians managed to set the second line of defence between the villages of Viersen-Heiligen and Isserstadt. The French advance was halted. However, by 11 AM, Ney's 6th Corps was on the scene, and Napoleon launched another attack. Augereau captured Isserstadt, Ney occupied Viersen-Heiligen, and Soult turned the Prussian left. By 1 PM, Hohenlohe had committed all his reserves in order to keep his line intact. Reserves from Weimar were desperately needed. Napoleon ordered his whole line to advance, and the Prussians finally collapsed. By 3 PM, the Prussians were in full retreat, with the French cavalry chasing them. The reserves from Weimar finally arrived and stopped the French at Kapellendorf. Röckel, who was leading the newly arrived 15,000 Prussians, didn't set a proper line and decided to counterattack. Although the French forces were initially halted, their cavalry soon outflanked and routed the enemy. By 4 PM, the Battle of Jena was over. The French had lost about 6,500 men, while the Prussian losses have been estimated at 25,000. Napoleon was sure that he had defeated the main Prussian army. He was wrong. At this point, his Marshal Davout was fighting the Prussian Prince Brunswick. On the previous day, Davout was ordered to move to the south and attack what Napoleon considered to be the main Prussian army from the north. He also was told to join forces with Bernadotte. However, the latter declined and kept his position at Dornberg as he was ordered to before. In the early morning, Davout's 28,000 left their positions near the river Saale and moved towards Auerstadt. Here they were attacked by 52,000 Prussians with no hope of support. Early in the battle, the French took the village of Hassenhausen. The French leader deployed his 3 divisions nearby despite repeated charges by Prussian cavalry. By 8:30 am, Davout's infantry managed to rout the enemy cavalry, but the Prussian infantry was arriving to the battle. The French stopped a number of Prussian attacks, mainly because the Prussians attacked in small groups, with each division advancing in isolation. As their leader was mortally wounded early on, the Prussians lacked any coordinated command. At 11 am, when the Prussians had exhausted their efforts, Davout ordered a French advance and the Prussians collapsed. By the end of the battle, Davout had inflicted 10,000 casualties and taken 3,000 prisoners, while he lost 7,000. Over the next few weeks, a relentless French pursuit caused more casualties to the Prussians, and Berlin was occupied on the 27th. In less than a month since the start of the campaign, Napoleon's forces killed 20,000 Prussians and took more than 140,000 prisoners. Still, the Prussian leadership retreated towards the Russian army, so the War of the Fourth Coalition was just starting. The War of the Fourth Coalition erupted in October of 1806, and in less than a month, French Emperor Napoleon had utterly defeated the Prussian army at the battles of Jena and Auerstedt and occupied Berlin. The Prussians could not oppose the Grand Army, but despite that, King Frederick William III refused to negotiate and fled to Königsberg in eastern Prussia, as he was assured that Russian armies would soon support him. Indeed, 68,000 Russians under Bennigsen were in Grodno, and a 40,000-strong force commanded by Buxtehude was on its way. Napoleon knew that he had to decisively defeat the Russians to win the war, but his supply lines were still not secure enough, as some of the Prussian strongholds continued their resistance. So, in early November, he sent the corps of Marshal Davout across the Oder River to prevent the Russians from setting their defensive line there. Fortunately for the French, the main Prussian bastion of Magdeburg fell on November 8th, and on the next day, Davout entered Poznan, which triggered a patriotic Polish uprising. The Poles started fighting against the remainder of the Prussian forces in the area. At the same time, the fall of Magdeburg allowed Napoleon to move more corps across the Oder, and that forced Bennigsen to stop and wait for his reinforcements. A lack of supplies was preventing Napoleon from marching at his usual fast pace, so he entered Warsaw only on the 19th of December. Still, he attempted a pincer move by moving some of his forces to the north. The Russian troops were spread 60 kilometers to the north of Warsaw, between Pultusk and Gulimin. On the 26th of December, the French attacked from the northwest and south, but failed to encircle the Russian troops. Bennigsen managed an orderly retreat to Bialystok, where he decided to winter. Although Napoleon hoped to chase the enemy, the winter was too harsh, and he also had to send his corps back to their winter cantonments. Both armies had a hard time procuring rations. By the middle of January, the situation became critical, and Bennigsen started moving towards Danzig. It was still controlled by the Prussians and had ample supplies. Coincidentally, Marshal Ney attempted a raid towards Heilsberg on the 17th of January. Napoleon was furious and ordered Ney to return. The latter complied. At the same time, the Russians reached the position of Bernadotte and threatened to cut him off from the majority of French troops. The French marshal was too quick for them and retreated to the south. The Russians caught up at Murungen, but Bernadotte scored a minor victory and successfully withdrew. All that gave Napoleon a brilliant idea. He ordered Bernadotte and Ney to continue their withdrawal, while Augereau, Soult and Davout were commanded to march north. The goal was to cut the Russian retreat and impose a general battle. Unfortunately for Napoleon, constant rains made the road impassable, and on the 31st of January, his messenger to Bernadotte was caught by Russian Cossacks, which allowed Bennigsen to learn of the Emperor's plans and retreat. French troops almost caught up to the Russians on 2 occasions in early February, but Bennigsen was able to escape. However, further retreat was impossible, as that would have let the French capture crucial Königsberg. Bennigsen stopped at the small town of Preussisch-Eylau, modern-day Bagratianovsk, in Russia. He asked for assistance from the 12,000-strong Prussian corps under Lestock that was nearby. Napoleon knew of the Prussian forces in the area and ordered Ney to prevent them from joining Bennigsen, but the Prussians managed to avoid the French marshal. The Battle of Eylau took place on the 7th and 8th of February 1807. At the beginning of the battle, the Russians had about 66,000 troops against 45,000 with Napoleon, but the Emperor knew that Ney and Davout, each with 15,000 soldiers, were within marching distance. The Russians had a decided advantage in artillery, with 450 guns against Napoleon's 200. Bennigsen needed time to set up his troops to the northeast of Eylau, so he left his rearguard under the command of Bagration to cover the deployment. The Russian general was able to repulse the French initially, but by midday, Augereau and the Imperial Guard joined the battle, and Bagration had to retreat under overwhelming French pressure. Bagration retreated towards the main army, while General Barclay screened his withdrawal in the town of Eylau. The layout of the town wasn't conducive to an attack, and Barclay managed to defend his positions well into the evening. By 2200 hours he was ordered to move back and join Bennigsen. The Russian commander knew that not all of the French troops were present, and ordered part of his right flank to strengthen the reserves, which weakened his wing. The morning started with an artillery duel. As the French were expecting the arrival of Davout's corps from the southwest, Soult was ordered to attack the Russian right and create a diversion. However, the Russians stopped Soult, and when the vanguard of Davout's forces arrived, they were intercepted by the cavalry reserve. Napoleon needed to win time to let the remainder of Davout's soldiers join the battle, so he ordered his centre and right to attack. A blizzard started and blinded the centre of the French army led by Augereau. Visibility was so limited that the French artillery mistakenly bombarded Augereau, who walked right into the Russian artillery battery. More than 5,000 French died in the centre without reaching the Russian lines, while the French right didn't do much damage to the Russian left. Bennigsen counterattacked against the French right, led by Saint-Hilaire with his cavalry, and forced it to stop its advance, while his infantry moved against the French centre, which was defended by what was left of Augereau's corps. However, Napoleon still had his guard to send in. While the infantry units joined the centre and stopped the enemy advance, the cavalry portion of the guard attacked the Russians from the rear, and the majority of this column was destroyed. The French also had Murat's cavalry in reserve, and it was ordered to counterattack. The right wing of these units attacked the Russian cavalry fighting Saint-Hilaire's right flank and scattered them. Murat and Saint-Hilaire continued their movement, and although the infantry was stopped, their cavalry charge dispersed every Russian unit in front of it and reached the reserves. At this point in the battle, Davout's remaining troops arrived and attacked the Russian left. And while Soult, Augereau, Murat and the Guard held their positions, Davout, supported by Saint-Hilaire, pushed the Russians back, and by 1530 the Russian left and left centre were almost at a 90-degree angle to the rest of the forces. Luckily for Bennigsen, 9,000 Prussians commanded by Lestock entered the battle and joined the beleaguered Russian left. The Prussians attacked Davout from the right and slowly pushed him away. By 1900 hours, Davout had to retreat and set a line between the villages of Kötschitten and Anklappen. Around that time, Ney's corps, which was supposed to stop Lestock, entered the fray. His forces moved against the extreme right of the Russian troops, but Bennigsen used the remainder of his cavalry to intercept them. The battle continued until 2200 hours, at which point the sides disengaged. Both armies lost at least 15,000 troops, and it is possible that Napoleon's army suffered more casualties. Despite that, at 2300 Bennigsen ordered a retreat. The French were in no shape to chase the enemy, and although the battlefield belonged to Napoleon, it was clear that for the first time in his career he had failed to win a decisive battle. Eylau indicated that the War of the Fourth Coalition was far from over. Although the Russian forces under Bennigsen retreated from Eylau, the battle ended in a draw, and both sides suffered massive losses. The Russian general knew that he had ample foodstuffs and ammunition in Königsberg, while Napoleon was away from his primary supply centers, so he retreated to the northeast. The French troops had to withdraw to their winter quarters in central Poland. To the north, the city of Danzig was still under Prussian control. Napoleon had to get rid of this nuisance, as it was a potential foothold for British and Swedish troops to open a second front against him. The fresh 10th Corps under Marshal Lefebvre besieged the city on the 27th of February. To the west, Marshal Mortier's troops were fighting the Swedes under von Essen, and managed to defeat them on the 16th of April at Belling. Sweden was forced to sign a ceasefire to keep its holdings in Pomerania, and that freed up Mortier. This spoilt the Allies' plans. The Russian reinforcements bound for Danzig on British ships didn't get any Swedish assistance. Lefebvre managed to stop these reinforcements on the 15th of May without lifting the siege. On the 19th of May, British ships with provisions for the city were captured by the French, and the city had to surrender on the 27th. Napoleon now secured his rear and was planning to move towards Königsberg to leave Bennigsen no other option but to fight. By this point, Napoleon had around 200,000 troops under his command, against 120,000 Russians and Prussians. However, unexpectedly for him, Bennigsen rushed forward. On the 4th of June, advanced columns of the Russian forces attacked the corps of Soult, Bernadotte and Ney. The first two marshals retreated while inflicting casualties to the Russians, but the primary target was Ney. His 17,000 soldiers were forced to defend against more than 60,000 Russians commanded by Bennigsen. With the river Pasvanka behind him, Ney had to be extremely careful and retreat slowly. His troops were under constant pressure from the Russian forces for 2 days, but managed to move beyond the river. Davout, who had been behind Ney, started moving his corps to his right in an attempt to confuse the Russians. On the 7th of June, he sent a messenger to Ney, claiming that his 40,000 men would soon attack the Russians from behind. This messenger was sent along a particular road that made it impossible for him to not be captured. Indeed, the message was intercepted by Bennigsen, and the Russians retreated in haste. By the 9th, the Russians were back at their well-fortified positions near Heilsberg. That was just what Napoleon needed, as he was eager to cut Bennigsen from Königsberg and the Prussian forces led by Lestock. On the 10th, Murat and Lannes attacked Bennigsen at Heilsberg. The Russian positions were well defended, but the goal wasn't to win. While the battle at Heilsberg raged for 2 days, Davout and Soult pushed Lestock towards Königsberg. On the 11th, the forces under Lannes threatened Bennigsen from the north, and the Russians had to retreat yet again. Napoleon was sure that Bennigsen would try to cross the Aller River near Friedland and move to Königsberg. He left 80,000 under his own command, while Lannes was ordered to move to Friedland quickly. The forward units of Lannes arrived in the town on the morning of the 13th of June. As Napoleon predicted, Bennigsen's forces were trying to move across the river at this location. The Russians managed to drive Lannes' cavalry out of Friedland. At this point, the French marshal had only around 15,000 troops against 60,000 Russians. Bennigsen was confident that he could easily crush Lannes without fighting the main French army. The latter was now sure that he was facing the full force of the enemy and asked Napoleon to move all available troops to assist him. The French reinforcements were en route, so Lannes decided to draw as many Russians as possible across the river. By 8 o'clock on the 14th, 40,000 Russians had crossed the river, but passing through the narrow streets of Friedland slowed them down, and that allowed Lannes to set up his defences in the nearby villages. The French heavy cavalry managed to stay in the village of Heinrichsdorf, despite artillery bombardment and attacks on their positions from 3 sides. To the south, in the forest of Zortlag, Russian infantry was facing their French counterparts. Lannes ordered his troops to fight in a loose formation, which helped as the forest was too dense for a massed attack. The the Russians were only able to form a front at 9 o'clock. Their main point of attack was still Heinrichsdorf. The Russian cavalry attempted to encircle the troops defending the village, but more French troops entered the fray and drove the Russians back. In the centre of the battlefield, Bennigsen tried to take Postenen, but the French infantry held their ground, and all attempts to outflank them with cavalry failed as Lannes was receiving more reinforcements, which then covered the defending troops. By 10 o'clock, the corps of Marshal Mortier joined the battle, spearheaded by the Polish cavalry, which screened Heinrichsdorf from the south. By 11 o'clock, the Russian attacks slowed down, as the French now had a comparable number of troops. From his command point on the right side of the river, Bennigsen saw that new French troops were close by. He knew that he was now entrapped, as his forces were too slow to retreat across the river while fighting off Napoleon. The French Emperor arrived at 1400 hours. After quickly assessing the situation, Napoleon ordered Ney to form up the right flank of his army, while Mortier was on the left and Lannes in the centre, with Victor Perrin's corps and the Guard in reserve. At 1700 hours, French artillery started its bombardment. Meanwhile, Ney was commanded to move forward. His troops cleared up the forest and took the village of Zortlach, but were counterattacked by the Russian cavalry, which charged against Ney's left flank. However, the French cavalry was able to drive the Russians back. Ney was getting closer to Friedland, and that is when the Russian guns stopped his advance. One more wave of Russian cavalry attempted to attack him from the left, but Napoleon sent an infantry division under Dupont, which closed up the breach. Bennigsen moved his guard against Dupont, but the French bayonets won the engagement. All that activity allowed the French to move part of their artillery and bombard Friedland. By 1900 hours, Ney was in the town, while Dupont continued moving to the north. The Russian right tried to retake Friedland and save the centre of the army, but was attacked by the French units defending Heinrichsdorf. By 2200 hours, the battle was over. Around half of the Russian forces were able to retreat from the battlefield, but their casualties were around 30,000, while Napoleon lost 10,000. Chasing the enemy was impossible, as the French cavalry was utterly exhausted. On the 18th of June, Königsberg surrendered. Russian Tsar Alexander I saw no reason to continue fighting, while Napoleon wasn't ready to attack Russia. A peace treaty between France and Russia was signed on the 7th of July in Tilsit. Russia was to join the continental blockade against the United Kingdom, while Napoleon acknowledged that Finland was in the sphere of Russian interests and promised not to ally with the Ottoman Empire. 2 days later, Napoleon signed a treaty with the Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm III. Prussia also joined the continental blockade. It had to cede all its Polish lands, and the Great Duchy of Warsaw was formed. Prussia also gave away the territory to the west of the Elbe River, and the Kingdom of Westphalia, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome, was established here.